our first ever kickoff of the ICM primer for New Jersey State Department of Transportation. My name is Asha Abalesha. I'm with Leidos, and we actually support Federal Highway on the ICM initiative. Together here we have also Sam Adam, who is also from Leidos and supports the program, as well as April Armstrong, who's facilitating the webinar today. So I'm going to actually hand it over to April in a couple seconds here. Just a note, I just want to check in. Is anyone having problems viewing the screen or hearing me? Nope?
No.
Okay, great. And I'll just ask one more time if everyone can just mute their mics, just to make it easier for everyone else in the webinar to hear. And the other thing I just want to let everyone know is that this is being recorded so that you guys can have it as a point of reference if you need to check out at any point during the webinar or you want to go back and review some of the materials. We will make the materials available to you afterwards, but then as well we'll have the webinar recording for you to look at as well. So with that, I'm going to actually hand it over to April and enjoy the webinar.
Good morning, everyone. How is everyone today? I know you guys are all on mute, so you're probably all shouting enthusiastically that you're doing fabulous. It's an honor to be with you all this morning. I have to tell you, I have a sister that lived in New York City for 14 years. I have family up in the New Jersey area, so it's really fun to be doing this webinar. I led the Integrated Corridor Management Knowledge and Technology Transfer work for about 7 years, just prior to ICM moving out of the research realm, out of the lab, and on into regions and roadways and transit lines in the form of the original demonstration sites and what they call the 8 pioneer sites that were the first recipients of some of the DOT's seed funding for integrated corridor management, and that is why I was invited to come facilitate this webinar today. What you guys see in front of you, hopefully on your screens, is just a brief agenda. Over the next 90 minutes, we're going to walk through basically an ICM overview. The real purpose of our time this morning is to orient everyone on the line to integrated corridor management, to really kind of give you that primer, that ICM 101 background and backdrop that you will need to be able to participate fully and productively in your upcoming workshops around the development of your concept of operations and work as part of your grant award. So I do want to mention the assumption here is that folks may not have a thorough or comprehensive understanding of integrated corridor management. If you have been working in this domain for any amount of time, or you are involved in the development of your grant application, some of this is going to probably be repetitive or redundant. And I would invite you actually in that case to actually feel free to contribute into the conversation and really help fill in some of the holes with some of the site-specific or region-specific knowledge that you may have. So again, I do just want to say the purpose of this is to really prepare you all for these upcoming workshops and really kind of give everyone kind of that level setting, that common shared robust understanding and vocabulary really as you prepare for those workshops. So we're going to talk about what ICM is. We're going to talk very briefly about the ICM research program that has produced the guidebooks and guidance that hopefully you all will be using and following as part of your work, and a lot of the model documents, a lot of the example documents and documentation that is out there today produced by other sites that hopefully can allow you guys to really get a running start if that's helpful. And then we're going to touch on the ConOps development process. What does it mean to implement ICM? What do those first steps look like? Again, it's kind of that on-ramp into that workshop. Before we get started, though, actually one last thing I want to mention, and I'll mention this off and on throughout the webinar. Tomorrow is a part 2, second 90-minute webinar that will be led by a Cambridge systematics team and will focus on analysis, modeling, and simulation of ICM. That is going to be a more technical webinar from an information systems and data standpoint. I really encourage all of you to sit in on it. It will still be, I think, fairly high level, but to the extent that one of the great powerful things you can do with integrated corridor management is really implement or move towards at least the concept of decision support systems in your region. Analysis, modeling, and simulation foundations and fundamentals really helps prepare you for that, and also can be just phenomenally valuable in regional decision making around where to make investments and things like that. So that's what tomorrow's webinar will focus on, just so you guys know. Before we get started, so before we dive into integrated corridor management, what is it, why do it, etc. Let me just invite you guys, and this will also just make sure everyone's really comfortable in the chat window. I'm sure most of you guys have used platforms like WebEx before, but if you would take a minute and just dump into the chat window your agency and role and level of familiarity with ICM. You can sort of self-rate yourself. I'm an expert. I know nothing about it. I've heard of it. Vaguely familiar, in your own words. And what, if any, expectations you have for today's webinar. So it'll be kind of messy in the chat window. That's fine. I'll just be scanning really quickly. And this will also give you guys a sense of who is, who all is gathered here today. So let's just take a quick moment to do that. By the way, as you guys are typing into the chat window, I just have to say a quick factoid on New Jersey. I grew up playing soccer, and I just read a really fascinating article about how New Jersey is the soccer powerhouse in the United States. Like California has more, I guess, people in terms of pure numbers that have gone on to become soccer superstars, but New Jersey has the highest by far per capita number of people that have gone on to be phenomenal superstars. So anyway, I thought that was pretty cool. Okay, this is great. We have a nice mix, it looks like, of folks. I appreciate you guys, kind of giving us a flavoring of who's out there. Some of the perspectives you guys are bringing. New York City DOT, awesome. Awesome. Okay, lead agency for the ICM 495. I have reviewed both the New Jersey and the New York grant applications, so I have some familiarity with your all's ICM concepts. Excellent. We've got an MPO on the line. Okay. Excellent. Okay, and as we move forward, I definitely want this morning to be totally interactive. Some of you are going to feel comfortable unmuting and just verbalizing a question, and I want to invite you to do that at any time. And others may prefer to put a question into the chat box. Please feel free to do that as well, and we'll be actively monitoring the chat box. We'll be sure to get your question answered. So don't worry about interrupting. You know how these phone lines are. It's like sometimes you have to literally talk over the person to get that one-way feed to stop. So please do feel free to unmute and ask a question at any time. All right, I'm seeing most of you guys are looking for a better understanding of ICM. I don't necessarily know, and I won't presume to know your starting point, but my hope is that this morning will be a contribution to you in the work that you all have ahead as part of your work with the grant. All right, let's roll. So, we really want to begin with the question of why integrate at all. There's obviously been a lot of work over the past couple of decades in the arena of ITS. There are some phenomenal things happening in the space of ATDM, active transportation management, active traffic and demand management type work. I know your all's region has a lot going on in those spaces. And so why integrate? That certainly brings a lot of complexity. It ushers in complexity beyond that which exists today. Let's look at a couple of just some of the backdrop assumptions, behind integrated corridor management. Basically, you guys are familiar with this. It'd be interesting if you haven't already done this. I would encourage you, and this is where modeling and the AMS, the analysis, modeling, and simulation work that you guys will hear more on tomorrow can be really helpful. I would encourage you, if you guys don't already have this analysis for your region, to consider doing something like this to really get a sense of the relative weightings of the, in this case, 6 major contributing causes of congestion. 40% of congestion, at least in terms of the national statistics, is caused by bottlenecks. And of course, bottlenecks, often have an underlying infrastructure design cause in terms of supply and demand, and can be very, tough to manage. Those bottlenecks can be split into recurring and non-recurring congestion. Integrated corridor management brings one solution set in terms of softening the bottlenecks. Not going to eliminate the bottlenecks probably, but can help soften those bottlenecks by providing more and different options in the moment for travelers and pre-trip travelers. Traffic incidents, probably the second leading cause of certainly non-recurring congestion. Again, integrated corridor management through more robust traveler information, creating of new and different options, including delaying trips, can help to really soften those edges. And certainly all of the other major causes of congestion, signal timing. This is something that San Diego in particular has made some phenomenal adjustments around in terms of multi-county, multi-jurisdictional arterial signal timing and coordinating that signal timing differently with freeway operations to include their hot lanes, to include their incident management and work zone plannings. Definitely able to flush more traffic now through the arterials, through those multi-jurisdictional strategies than they had been doing in the past. So that's just another space where traditional approaches are really reaching their limit, basically. And because of that, countrywide, we're seeing less reliable travel times. One of the things I think is interesting is that peak period travel, at least in terms of national level statistics, more than 2/3 of peak period travel is now in extremely congested conditions, compared with around 1/3 25 years ago. Just over a generation ago, we can see just a massive shift in the levels of congestion during peak periods. Again, this is your all's regional or specific roadway graphs may look different here, but the bottom line is that current methods are kind of reaching a saturation point. They're doing all they possibly can, and so the question really now becomes what else is possible if we begin to think about connecting dots in different ways. I mean, basically, traditionally, a lot of agencies, not necessarily any of your alls, but traditionally agencies are measuring traffic on one day. They're calculating a solution, signal timing, and other things based on that measured traffic at that one point in time. They're fine-tuning a solution for about 15 minutes, and then they're just sort of letting that go. Integrated corridor management is really about doing that on a continual basis, and and integrating not just that one agency or that one facility's options into the mix, but really moving out across the parallel facilities, moving vertically across the interconnecting jurisdictions, and really spreading the options. to really soften those hot spots. So this just, the bottom line on this slide is just, there's a need to really increase the cross-network management to more responsively manage increased demand and even sudden, reductions in demand. And this slide is just, very high-level bird's eye view of history. Don't worry about what looks like a whole bunch of like Easter eggs or Stonehenge or something. Really, the point here is that integrated corridor management is really about building on the legacy of the past 20 years of investments in ITS, investments in things like planning for operations and new ways of doing things operationally, and bringing it together into a more integrated perspective across a corridor. So that's another real key theme is corridor level integration. What becomes possible. In fact, I would actually invite you all to take a moment and throw some thoughts into the chat just from your unique vantage point, your unique point of view, the things you see on a day-to-day basis. In your own words, what does become possible when you have the ability to measure corridor level performance, meaning multimodal across a corridor? What becomes possible when proactive approaches are able to be put in place increasingly? Not that there aren't any today, but when really the corridor is defined by proactive approaches rather than reactive more and more. And when the information that you and your teams receive is truly actionable in the moment, what would become possible? So take a minute, if you would, actually, and just throw a couple of thoughts into the chat box about that. What are some of the possibilities that you see, whether it's operationally, from the customer's perspective, even when you look ahead 10 years, when you think, what will this corridor be like in 10 years when we begin to operate and put in place some of these more integrated approaches? Awesome. Integrated multimodal information sharing. Cool. Shift away from roadway-centric planning and projects. Interesting. Yeah, some good stuff. So the ICM vision really is, an opportunity exists to realize significant improvements in the efficient movement of people and goods through integrated and proactive management of major multimodal transportation corridors. So what is integrated corridor management? It's the joint management of a transportation corridor as a complete system. If I was to ask you guys how many agencies on a day-to-day basis do you in the course of your normal day-to-day work, how many agencies on a day-to-day basis would you say that you actively coordinate with? You can throw it in the chat or you can shout it out on the line, but how many would you say that is today? And there's no right or wrong answer, by the way. It certainly varies with every agency, but on average, what would you say that would be? Put it into the system or unmute yourself and feel free to shout out. Okay, so we've got at least one organization that coordinates with maybe, say, 3 to 4 agencies. How about some of the rest of you? How many agencies on a day-to-day basis would you say you guys coordinate with? 5 plus, okay.
16.
Oh, over 16 within the region on a day-to-day basis? That's pretty cool. Okay, excellent. One of the biggest shifts with integrated corridor management over time, this doesn't necessarily happen, right away, but, over time is really truly seeing the number of agencies that you work with on a day-to-day basis will grow. That will grow. It's kind of like today in the Homeland Security world, there's not necessarily a reason for 50 agencies to come together and actively collaborate, but when a catastrophic event occurs, many of you certainly know this, in the New York region, those agencies come together in a heartbeat, and they have to be able to work together seamlessly. Obviously, day-to-day traffic, recurring congestion, it's a much smaller scale challenge in some ways, but integrated corridor management really is about getting that larger, more, that amplified team working together seamlessly on a day-to-day basis to manage traffic, basically throughput. So ICM's research program, just a quick couple of words on that, because that's really been the foundation that's brought us even to this telecall this morning. That program had a goal of really blazing trails in congestion management. It was a part of the Department of Transportation's congestion management program, actually. It was really about optimizing existing transportation infrastructure along a corridor, looking in every nook and cranny, looking for underutilized assets, asking questions around, is it possible? How could those assets be better utilized? Enabling travelers to make even more informed decisions. And somebody mentioned this earlier in the chat, and equipping them to dynamically shift modes. This is a behavioral shift for travelers in many cases to start to think about things like buses, metro, and other options even as one of 5 choices they have on any given day at any given place they might be in their trip planning. Those that are able to have those choices to have that even on their radars, is a mental shift for much of the traveling public. Reducing travel times and delays, obviously, and increasing travel time reliability and predictability. That was certainly a key objective. From a program standpoint, the research program really sought to demonstrate and evaluate these proactive integrated approaches and to provide the institutional guidance, operational capabilities, and technical methods that regions would need in order to really start connecting these networks, sharing the data, getting that richer data picture, and making different operational decisions. Super quick, just kind of retrospective on the program. It started really back in the early 2000s with the majority of the demonstration work occurring in the around the 2010 time frame, 2010 to about 2013 time frame. There were 8 original pioneer sites. We'll talk in a moment about those sites. 2 of those sites were funded to demonstrate ICM, and evaluation work, I believe, is nearing finalization. Is that right? Is Deepak on the line? Deepak,
Was.
are you with us on the line? Okay, he might have had to drop off. I believe he may be involved in leading the evaluation work for those 2 demonstration sites. I was going to invite him to speak on that. What they have found in the modeling work and some of the preliminary evaluation work is that ICM really has benefits in the following areas: mobility, safety, reliability, environmental benefits in terms of emissions and fuel consumption, and just benefit costs for the implementing agencies. The early simulations that were done, and again, tomorrow's webinar will present to you guys more the methodologies and the tools behind those simulations. These are tools that you guys would be able to use if you chose to. There's a dedicated guidebook around just the analysis, modeling, and simulation alone. But those simulations found significant benefits, and you can see here on this slide the average travel time savings in terms of person hours across the corridors, the reliability improvements across the corridors, the fuel savings, and the emissions savings. And those benefits were compelling enough that those regions decided to invest themselves in moving forward with integrated corridor management, along with obviously some assistance from the Department of Transportation. But ICM benefits do far outweigh the cost because, and that makes intuitive sense really, because it's really about making the most of existing infrastructure and putting small things in place, relatively small, light lift things in place that can really help squeeze more juice out of that infrastructure. A couple of final just points on benefits. Certainly I know Ural's region is a huge freight region. What you see here are some of the benefits from a freight perspective that were influenced actually by freight stakeholders in these regions. These were benefits as they saw them of integrated corridor management. Another thing I know is certainly a big issue in a region as populous as Ural's region is incident management. Traffic incident management is definitely one of the sets of strategies that integrated corridor management leverages, and it's probably self-evident in terms of the kinds of benefits that greater integration can bring in that space. And then transit obviously has a huge presence in the New Jersey and New York corridors. Transit integration, that was something that Dallas, at both of the demonstration sites had transit aspects. Dallas had probably a heavier transit integration aspect, so that may be a site you're interested to look into over time. But more comprehensive knowledge of corridor operations. This was something that in the two demonstration sites there really hadn't been necessarily originally a super tight operational connection between freeways, arterials, and transit. That was very new for them, and integrated corridor management allowed them to do that multi-jurisdictionally up and down the corridor. And actually it helped them justify funding in some cases for transit improvements to really be able to show the backdrop of the freeway and arterial demand scenarios. These slides just basically depict who out there is involved in some way in integrated corridor management. These are the two demonstration sites where you see the pictures: San Diego's I-15 corridor, and Dallas, Texas's US 75 corridor, both of them multimodal and multi-jurisdictional. The other stars that you see are the other of the 8 pioneer sites, and then the little other dots are just other regions in the country that are moving forward in some way with integrated corridor management concepts and strategies. These little red hot air balloons are your fellow grant sites. Those are locations you guys may enjoy reaching out to and getting, collaborating with over the coming year. So if we were to take a closer look now at integrated corridor management, and actually, before I go any further, are there any questions at all on the ICM program or any of the other implementing locations or anything that we've covered so far? Feel free again to verbally shout out or to just put a question in the chat box. All right, so I think we've talked about the ICM goal. Here is something in the words of Alex Estrella, who is the manager of San Diego's ICM initiative. Interestingly, that location, Alex was more affiliated really probably with that MPO and led their ICM implementation. In the Dallas demonstration site, it was actually led by a transit agency, DART. Dallas Area Rapid Transit was the main leader. You see all different models for ICM leadership, but in Alex's words here, ICM provides the opportunity to proactively improve and maximize the performance of the transportation system by serving as an alternate to traditional major infrastructure investments, which may be certainly more expensive or just constrained even by environmental or even just footprint limitation issues. So if we were to break integrated corridor management down and just look, even more closely at these words, what does it mean to truly be integrated? With ICM, what you're really talking about here is 3 dimensions of integration. Institutional integration, again, on what may be in some regions, an unprecedented level. Coordination, moving from coordination as needed to an active and daily normal way of doing business, of collaboration between all of the agencies and jurisdictionals, transcending what may traditionally be institutional boundaries, really expanding that team beyond the walls of an agency or even your normal city or county region, reaching across, boundary spanning leadership, really, if you've heard that buzzword in the management world, it's very true in integrated corridor management. Operational integration, multi-agency and cross-network operational strategies, managing the total capacity and demand of the corridor. Again, that's really where you're going to be, challenged to think differently about what could be possible within even the existing infrastructure of the corridor. And technical integration, and this is really what makes it all possible without that more robust picture of what's happening on the corridor in a near real-time manner. This is very, very difficult to do. So this is really the nucleus of enabling ICM, which is the sharing and distribution of information, systems operations and control functions to support the immediate analysis and response. And in some cases, especially if you go in the direction of a decision support system, you can really move into, and San Diego has done this, you can really increasingly move into the predictive realm because you see enough of, it's not actually changing slides, any idea? Let's see here. You see enough of the same kinds of, over time, the same kinds of incidents, the same kinds of patterns are emerging that allows you to become more predictive with a tool like a decision support system. These are just examples of integration problems, today in many regions. And I'd be interested to hear you guys, maybe in the chat window, if you could, which of these, if any, or maybe it's something different that comes to mind for you. What do you all see from, again, your unique points of view as examples of integration problems in the corridors that you're both, I say both meaning New Jersey and New York, that you guys are both looking at? What are some examples of integration problems in those corridors? I don't mean to put you guys on the spot because I know it may not be something you're thinking about every day. We can keep moving, but I would encourage you to really think about whatever problems immediately come to mind when you think of the corridor. Expand out from that and really think about those problems from these 3 dimensions: the institutional, operational, and technical, and really allow that to guide you, especially when you go into that workshop environment next week. Allow that to guide you as you really think, as you start to put in place some of the pillars of your concept of operations. This again is in the words of the San Diego ICM team. This is really how they see and are already seeing that ICM is changing the way they do things. They are now operating and managing across jurisdictions, not on an as-needed basis, but on an everyday basis. They have entered into long-term institutional commitments with a broader set of agencies than they ever had before in that corridor. And because of their decision support system, which they're calibrating, continually, they are increasingly able to really proactively measure throughput, productivity, reliability, and proactively respond sooner and faster and more responsively as any anomaly occurs in the corridor. We won't spend a ton of time here because you guys have already defined your corridors, but for those, again, in the grant packages, but for those who are new, it's basically, it's a linear geographic band, people, goods, services moving through that corridor, parallel networks that provide similar or complementary functionalities from a transportation standpoint. And obviously in this case, we're talking, the freeways, the arterials, all the transit systems, bike and ped routes, and all of the interconnecting technologies that are facilitating that. And then management. So we've talked about what it means to be integrated operationally, institutionally, technically. We've talked about, well, where are we applying that integration? We're applying it across multimodal corridors. And what does it mean to manage? In this case, really this notion of active management of all individual facilities and really moving from a passive way of managing to an active day-to-day way of managing. ICM is really based on the concept of load balancing, managing supply and demand across, the dimension of time and space, of course. Now, many of you are probably familiar with, or all of you maybe even, with ATDM, Active Traffic or Transportation Demand and Demand Management. There are often questions, how does ICM relate to this, to our ATM or ATDM strategies? And that's what this slide really seeks to help answer. ICM is based on that fundamental concept of load balancing. It's really applying information and insights in real time or as close to real time as possible to maximize corridor performance rather than any particular facility or mode or hotspot on a particular facility or mode. There is definitely synergy and overlap, though some aspects of integrated corridor management may not be active management, and some active management tools are not necessarily integrated. They have a very specific purpose and focus, and they may or may not be integrated. They definitely work together, though. ATDM is a huge enabler of ICM. And ICM really helps to leverage investments in ATDM by spreading those benefits. And for those who are not familiar with ATDM, it's really, the dynamic management, control, and influence. Influence is so key there of travel demand, traffic demand, and flow across transportation facilities can be applied in any context. You may often see ATDM type investments made on certain hotspots along a facility. And what you see here really is bringing these things together, again, into that corridor level optimization and operations. I like the next three slides because I think they really sort of lay out the directionality that from a conceptual standpoint that you want to be thinking about as you think about ICM. This notion of moving from a reactive posture towards a proactive posture in terms of what we know about the transportation system, what you see here labeled traffic knowledge, this notion of moving from a place of informing either ourselves as managers of that system or customers as users of that system, informing them about what's happening on the system, moving increasingly towards a more proactive, forward-leaning posture of guiding, beginning to guide them about what could be happening, where they could be going, other choices they have. And from a traffic management perspective, moving from a sense, again, of knowing what's happening today in this moment to predicting what's happening, that directional shift is really what allows you to move towards that proactive posture. And, again, in this case, moving from a set of single objectives towards multiple objectives, and that those objectives can be simultaneously accomplished. and moving from individual or single agency management of a facility, for example, to joint management. That doesn't necessarily mean joint ownership or joint authorities on the system, but that there's a model of joint decision making and active collaboration in place. And the idea here is, as you move from, you move up that active continuum, what you see there on the left, and further down the integrated path, you move from, you guys are not necessarily in any one of these purple boxes. I personally think your region is probably somewhere in this yellow box, but the idea is to move towards the top right corner of the yellow box, moving from active but not integrated, or places where you may have integrated things but maybe they're not fully active, really moving towards active and integrated as a way of being on the corridor. If you've heard any reference to a capability maturity model, I wish I could do like a show of hands here. Some of you guys may have heard of this. Some of you, this may be newer for. I just want to plant the seed here because you may hear the term come up again in your work with the grant stuff. But this was originally, this concept of capability maturity was originally developed by Carnegie Mellon University in the software engineering realm. And it's this notion of really moving from being able to do something once when it's when needed, kind of reactively. That's what you see level 1 there. There's some ability to do things, but they tend to be unpredictable. They're poorly controlled. They tend to be reactive. The idea of moving up a maturity set of stages, basically, those processes become repeatable. They then get defined. That allows other people to plug into those processes more seamlessly. That allows other people to replicate the processes more seamlessly. By level 4, those processes are now measured and managed. That allows for continual process improvement, which is the level 5 optimization sort of state. ICM, and you're seeing this in other realms of transportation, is sort of adopting this model of this concept of a capability maturity model. And the invitation here is to really kind of self-assess, plot yourself, your region, in this case, the corridor, on this capability maturity model. There's no right or wrong answer. It's really about the collective stakeholders coming together and sort of agreeing this is our starting point. Today we think we're, wherever it is, we're at level 2 or we're level 3. Or maybe you're at level 1, that's fine. The idea is to just have that sort of sense of where we are today so that we know, the direction that we're moving in. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides. I think you guys will probably get the slide deck. I just want to orient you to them because, again, you may hear some of this terminology in the workshop. You may want to use some of this terminology in your workshop as you contribute to the development of your concepts of operations. But when you think about institutional approaches in ICM, the idea really is the idea of moving from what may be less formal approaches towards more formal approaches, not necessarily, heavy-handed or cumbersome, but the idea that they are repeatable, that they are measurable enough that you can get those sort of continuous improvements, identify and put in place calibration and improvements to those institutional approaches. So the idea of moving from like ad hoc arrangements based on, near-term issues that have been identified, personal relationships, obviously, which is the fuel of all progress ultimately. So it's not about this going away. It's the idea that building on that to move towards a funded entity that might have a corridor manager type role, for example, that may or may not exist today, well-defined responsibilities related to ICM operations, that notion of moving towards the formal. What does ICM mean in terms of operational integration? Well, in terms of corridor integration, again, moving from less formal to more formal. And in this case, that means moving from a position of really coordinating, which, is characterized by things like, informal information sharing, largely relationship-based, some coordinated actions occurring, coordinated service delivery occurring on some level. but really shifting increasingly into a fully cooperative space, and then ultimately into what you see labeled here is that active collaborational space, shared corridor operations vision, the formal partnering that we just talked about, the shared use of resources. Ownership may still be intact, but there's thinking of those resources as strategic corridor-wide resources. Operational approaches, moving from a place of less integration to more integration, really moving from what might today be some level of information sharing and distribution, some level of operational efficiency, certainly of specific network junctions, really moving towards the ability to promote route and modal shifts, to really push that with the user base of the system, and really actively managing the capacity-demand relationship. And you can see here some specific strategies. I know you guys have a number of your own strategies that you're looking at. I would encourage you to think about where do you sort of see them fitting on this continuum. And then finally, technical integration. Again, you really see everything sort of moving from the less formal to more formal, moving from alerts being provided sort of here and there as needed to, in the case of San Diego, this very active decision support system, this corridor manager role who's directly, you see the word here, controlling corridor field devices, but they're only doing that with full permission and detailed protocols that have been agreed to by all the corridor stakeholders. So nothing, that person's really acting as a steward in a way of the coordinator, not doing anything in a vacuum, but the coordination and the collaboration is so natural that it's seamless. I do see one question, and I want to invite you guys before we move into the last part of the real content piece of the webinar. I definitely want to take any questions that anyone may have. Just remember to unmute yourself. And I did see one question here in the chat. How do you define the width of a corridor? I'm not sure if that, if the question was answered, but I would say on that, in your all's case, you guys have actually defined your corridors, I think, pretty clearly in your grant applications. And so I would definitely encourage all of you, if you haven't really read the grant application, or if it's been a while, I would encourage you to really reread that and refresh your memory of that. It's actually a pretty easy read. I think it's just nicely done. It's very, very concise. But as preparation for your upcoming workshop. But the bottom line on how you define a corridor is it's entirely subjective. It's really about where do you want to, what facilities do you want to include, and then how long of, how big is the footprint really, and it's really entirely subjective, but it usually has something to do with sort of where you see some of the big demand patterns, the volume of both passenger and freight type traffic. Where do you really want to sort of focus investment of financial investment, time investment, energy investment in terms of some of these higher order integrated corridor management concepts. So it is a subjective definition. It's usually based on some of the kinds of things I just mentioned. And in the case of your two sites, you guys do have a very precise definition of the corridor and sort of the travel shed within that. And I would encourage everyone to definitely, look that over before that workshop. Did I hear someone unmuting themselves for a question? Or maybe somebody was muting themselves. Any questions at all before on what we've covered so far about what is ICM? How does it differ or relate really to ATDM concepts? All right, let's keep rolling. Again, please feel free at any time to shout a question out or put it into the chat, and we'll be sure to get it, answer it, hopefully. So are you ready for ICM? I mean, clearly you guys are. or you wouldn't, and you certainly feel you are, or you wouldn't have submitted the grant applications. DOT agrees you are, and that's why you all were selected for the grants. But these are the kinds of questions that the DOT encourages regions to ask themselves. The truth is, not everybody is ready for integrated corridor management. If you don't have the building blocks in place, then it would be premature to start to move in this direction. There is an ICM implementation guide that we'll show you all how to access that at the end of this telecall. But I definitely want to make you guys aware of it. The DOT will be expecting that I think the grant sites really follow this guide, and certainly you're encouraged to leverage other regions' concept of operations documents as templates as much as that can be helpful. But the guide really walks regions through a 7-phase ICM implementation process and offers specific suggestions for the management of that process, how to approach each of those phases. Based on the experiences of those 8 pioneer sites, all 8 of those sites contributed to the development of this guide based on their lessons learned. And the nice thing about those 8 sites was that they are really all so different. They all have different, they certainly have commonalities in terms of feeling that their networks weren't optimized and multimodal networks, et cetera, but different strategies in place, different ITS types of investments in place, different institutional models. And so the idea is that really with that number of sites contributing to the development of the guide, that really any region across the country is going to be able to see themselves in that guide and get assistance along the way. This is the 7-phase implementation process for ICM. You guys have certainly already gotten started, number 1. You've already established goals, number 2. You're in the process, I think, of number 3, this planning for success. The development, primarily the concept of operations. Obviously, a program management plan and a systems engineering plan will also be done. And you see that little pink bar across the top. This is where analysis, modeling, and simulation type work can be really valuable, and that will be the focus of tomorrow's call. That 7-step process that you see right here, it basically maps to the systems engineering process. Those of you that are familiar with that V diagram, if this is more intuitive for you, you're welcome to look at this. If this is less intuitive for you, you're welcome to look at this 7-step process because it is fully congruent with the systems engineering approach. And what you see here is just an even more simplified sort of version, in a way, of the corridor management process. And we'll just quickly walk through this. This is what you all will be doing next week. You all essentially have established a concept exploration working group. You've already defined your candidate corridors. You've really already done a lot of this as part of the grant work. You've identified those problems and issues. You may or may not decide to do more in the realm of the analysis, modeling, and simulation to look more closely at those issues, to pinpoint them and pinpoint potential areas of benefit even more. But in your consensus building work together, you guys are going to be getting even more precise about the goals and objectives and inventorying, building really on the initial inventory that you guys already have in the grant application, but of assets, resources, capabilities, moving into the selection of specific strategies, really getting the stakeholder buy-in, and funding those projects ultimately. What you see here is those of you, I know we have a couple of planning folks on the phone or folks from MPOs on the phone. The concept development process strongly urges folks to sort of take that planning for operations approach. And this graphic here is out of FHWA's planning for operations body of work. And it's the whole idea of this objectives-driven, performance-based approach. So you'll be encouraged to use that. This is an example of some of the next steps in the concept development work. You guys have definitely already outlined and inventoried the assets and resources and capabilities available in the 2 corridors. The next line of questioning will really be who owns what, Where are those things located? What condition are they in? Where are there opportunities to potentially feed other aspects of the network? Where can resources be repurposed or further leveraged? What capabilities do we have in place that with even a small investment or adjustment to how we're using it could really be optimized or expanded? Just examples here of resources. Examples here of, in this case, the ITS architecture. We won't spend time on this, but obviously ITS is, is glue for the ICM infrastructure. Interfacing with that architecture, just making you guys aware of this resource, FHWA's applying a regional ITS architecture to support planning for operations, a primer. So it definitely is another great resource out there. Planning questions to consider. Again, next week you guys will be looking at these more closely. So this is sort of a preview, but what data is available? Who's using that data today? For what purpose? How often are they using it? What kinds of decisions is the data supporting on a day-to-day basis or even on an as-needed kind of crisis type basis? What are the gaps, problems, and issues for any given spot or location or region? What specific strategies are available? And moving into really defining those strategies in terms of detailed functional requirements and operational concepts. The data sharing piece is so huge in terms of obtaining a system-wide and multimodal view of operational performance. So I definitely would encourage you guys to go as deep and wide as you can in that. You can always kind of, go high level later and really get very clear about where you want to focus. But where do we need mutual standards for consistency and quality? Where do we need connections that don't exist today? What becomes possible when we can get a richer set of fused data than we're able to get today? And these are just some other key points to consider. Your all's agendas next week are going to take you into a lot of that in more detail. This just is sort of a preview of how you then identify, evaluate, and select strategies. You're really then looking at how the potential strategies map to or support those goals, objectives, and needs. An example of some of the kinds of tools you may choose to use. You see at the bottom, again, the analysis, modeling, and simulation. You'll hear more again about that tomorrow. And just an example of how this can start to look as you start to align strategies with objectives and even specific service packages. You're encouraged to look at prior experience and the experience of others. There are certainly, you guys have your own robust knowledge sets in your own regions, but the ITS JPO's knowledge base contains a ton of before and after studies. You can search and browse on those studies. You can certainly look and are encouraged to look at ICM deployments, in particular Dallas and San Diego's that took theirs all the way to a demonstration stage. This is just a list of resources for helping to determine candidate strategies. You may or may not need these. A little more detail here in terms of what that process looks like, analyzing the system problems and identifying system needs. Where are the gaps in capabilities? What are new desired capabilities that our existing capabilities don't satisfy? What data collection capabilities are needed, or even data analysis capabilities are needed to enable the new operational capabilities we're talking about. This is an example. This I think comes out of the ATDM world. The ICM analysis, modeling, and simulation uses sort of a similar approach of multi-scenario analysis. This can be really powerful in terms of helping you guys zero in on what specific strategies to apply under what specific conditions. And tomorrow you'll learn, again, in more detail about specific methods and tools that can enable you guys to do that kind of analysis in your corridor. I think you've actually done a lot of it, I know, already. So the question would be where and how, if at all, could you potentially build on that? Just an example of, stakeholders. One of the big questions with ICM, really in all 8 of the Pioneer sites, they started with an initial stakeholder group, and invariably they grew that group by 15 to 20% in terms of new agencies that along the way they realized really needed to be involved, that just were not initially top of mind. So these next slides are really just kind of, you could almost think of them as just sort of a checklist almost of types of organizations that at any point along the way you may realize, we really ought to get these people involved, either as a primary stakeholder or even just a bench sitter, informational stakeholder. And then as you guys move forward, this is you hear this so often about fostering champions, but really and truly, because ICM is so much about a paradigm shift, it's not just about putting a couple of new ITS capabilities in place. It's not just about connecting a couple of databases. It's really about a very different way of thinking about the corridor as a whole, putting jerseys on, the same color jersey on people from all different agencies, and really having that same team approach to the corridor. And that requires almost an ongoing, continual champion making type of approach, really. And hopefully all of you that are involved in the initial seed work for the ICM stuff, are probably best positioned to play a lot of this role in terms of influencing your own peers in your own agencies to see a different possibility for the future in terms of how the corridor is managed. And over time, as you actually start to implement the ICM type stuff, this isn't an imminent need, but over time you definitely will want to have, obviously, public outreach and education on the radar. San Diego and Dallas both actually did a pretty good job with this, because the real benefits of ICM, require people, all those users of the network, starting to make different choices that are now enabled through things like ICM. So just not, don't overlook that. Not that you guys would, but. And this is just, very high level overview of the concept for operations. The goals, facilitating a shared understanding. There's really probably a word missing there. A shared understanding of operational goals across all those stakeholders, describing those operational scenarios and system characteristics. We talked about the multi-scenario analysis, getting very clear on the priority scenarios of interest in your corridor, and really looking at different perspectives, looking at the corridor from the user's perspective, from the transportation manager's perspective, political perspectives. How will the system achieve mission goals? And then developing ultimately the detailed requirement specifications and interface specifications and partnership agreements to really make that happen. And this just sort of shows that building block approach. You're starting with what you have today in terms of corridor networks and infrastructure. You're layering on top of that joint operations, response, and action plans at an amplified level than likely what exists today, integrating data in entirely new ways, moving into a decision support posture, and really being able to have that more nimble corridor. And the idea being that the corridor's transportation network is then positioned to be continually operating at those optimal levels. These slides here just kind of give an overview of what happened at the 2 demonstration sites. We mention it because you may be interested to reach out at some point to those sites to tap more intimately into some of their lessons learned. But they designed and built those ICM systems. They deployed the supporting systems, integrated the data, developed joint operating plans in excruciating detail. But that's why and how the corridor is able to operate more seamlessly today, because they made the effort to really go to that level of detail in those operating plans, making data available because of trusted relationships across agencies that may not have been in place 5 years ago, and they are very different ways today. These are just examples of some of the kinds of capabilities that, that are now in place in those 2 demonstration site locations, and some of the examples of their ICM strategies that are in place now. Again, the key being that these are really implemented corridor-wide, multi-jurisdictionally, in that multimodal fashion. What you see here are just 3 different profiles. If you were to look at any one of those sites, these are the examples of their ICM strategies across the corridor. And just examples of the 2 vision statements of the 2 demonstration sites. I think you guys actually already have your vision statement in your grant package. Examples of their goals. Examples of, you guys have heard this probably 1,000 times about the SMART objectives. We won't hammer that, but definitely the idea of those objectives being as specific and measurable as possible so that you can really calibrate the ICM strategies really on a day-to-day level, actually. Examples of performance measures, if it's helpful when you guys get to that point in your ConOps, you can definitely look to these guidebooks to just almost like a menu. You can just pull out the measures that, that match your objectives. What you see here are just examples of the multi-tiered monitoring and evaluation that once those detailed performance metrics are defined and they're linked to those objectives and goals, what does multi-tiered monitoring and evaluation look like now across the corridor? A different way of looking at the corridor. And the value of periodically monitoring and evaluating is just, again, that main ability to recalibrate, calibrate those strategies. We mentioned earlier that there's an evaluation going on across the 2 demonstration sites. This slide basically lists the kinds of things that are being looked at. I think the evaluation data from the 2 pioneer sites, or the 2 demonstration sites, is expected is at like early fall. We're thinking, okay, so that may be something that you guys are interested to look at in terms of not just what analysis, modeling, and simulation estimated certain benefits would be, but what were those actual benefits of those various ICM strategies once those strategies were in place for 12 to 18 months. And, again, those detailed performance measures and everything we've talked about up till now, positions a region to move into this more robust use of decision support systems. You're going to hear more about those in tomorrow's webinar. They really can make a phenomenal difference, well, certainly with ATDM as well as ICM in terms of just providing that corridor level visibility. It's a wonderful, amazing precursor to things like connected vehicles, where the level of data is just going to grow so exponentially. So this can really sort of provide that kind of on-ramp to that. We won't go into a lot of detail about this because I don't know that everyone on the phone is equally interested in decision support systems, but I definitely want to be sure you guys understand the role that they can play in active management of a corridor and predictive management of a corridor. And again, just overview of a multi-pronged evaluation approach that is being used to look at the 2 demonstration sites, and we definitely encourage regions to look at what aspects of that approach can they use to look at their own corridors. Where can you copy aspects of that approach and not have to invent it out of whole cloth? And I mentioned earlier some of the resources that are available to you, the ICM implementation guide and also the analysis, modeling, and simulation guide, both of which are available on the JPO's website, which we'll give you guys in just a moment. But in addition to that, there are a number of model documents. All 8 of the pioneer sites developed concepts of operations. You may be interested to either follow those almost as a template or just look inside of those for examples of levels of detail and things like that. All 8 of those sites developed systems requirement specs for their ICM systems. And then the 2 demonstration sites, San Diego and Dallas, proceeded to do high-level design and detail design, systems acceptance testing, documentation. 3 of the sites underwent analysis, modeling, and simulation, and all of their reports and plans are also available to you. And again, those 2 guidance documents. The Planning for Operations website certainly has, phenomenal resources in terms of development of objectives that link to those goals and all the performance measures. So we just want to sort of reiterate that. And here's the address for, and you may want to bookmark it even, for obtaining the model documents, obtaining the ICM implementation guide and AMS guide. I think this website also has a couple of videos out there, one from San Diego, one from Dallas, if you want to get sort of a more dynamic, interactive, first-person perspective from the ICM implementers in those locations. We encourage you to check the videos out. I think they're like not more than 2 minutes each, so they're pretty short. And if you guys have any questions along the way in terms of knowledge and technology transfer or any of the resources that have been discussed, certainly you have plenty of points of contacts there in your region. But you're also welcome to send an email to Samantha Adams at samantha.n, as in Nathan, .adams@leidos.com, and she can just almost even act as a knowledge and technology transfer concierge in a way, just really help connect you to the right person or the right product if that's if you need it in a pinch and you're having a hard time putting your hands on it. Any questions at all before we, start to round the bend here? Does anybody have any questions about anything that's been covered or any of the resources that have been covered this morning? Okay, well, we're finishing a few minutes early here. I hope that that this morning's telecall and webinar was helpful in giving you all that sort of overview of ICM, helping you all have a bit of a fuller understanding of it, some of the vocabulary around it, the conceptual underpinnings, the dimensions of integration, and the notion of the corridor-wide approaches to prepare you all for participation in your upcoming workshops to develop your concept of operations. And congratulations again on being selected as 2 of the grant sites.